Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss Karl Marx, a well-known name to the public, yet whose work is often less understood. Contrary to some beliefs, Marx was not primarily a politician, but foremost an economist. He offered a deep critical analysis of the 19th century capitalist society, an analysis that continues to influence many current thinkers, including some liberal economists. Jacques Attali, for instance, though not known for communist ideas, has written an essay on Marx and openly expresses admiration for him. Marx was also a renowned philosopher, offering not just a doctrine, but a complete worldview. At the heart of this worldview is the concept of alienation, which we will explore today. But before delving into this concept, let's discuss Marx's influences, especially Hegel, who was his primary source of inspiration. As I mentioned in a previous video, Hegel placed great importance on history, seeing it as the arena where universal reason unfolds. This means he viewed history as having direction and meaning, a topic I will address soon in a video dedicated to the meaning of history. For Hegel, history unfolds like a rolling carpet, suggesting that nothing happens by chance. The carpet, as it unrolls, reveals its original form without adding or subtracting anything. Similarly, history unfolds, revealing the reason guiding it. For Hegel, this concept fits within an idealist philosophy where the spirit directs matter, which is orderly and evolves according to rational logic. This might seem abstract, but essentially for Hegel, historical events follow a precise direction. This idea forms the foundation of Marx's methodology, which, however, diverges by thinking that history is driven by material forces, mainly class struggle. Marx posits that human history is a history of class struggles, a perspective hard to refute, as history is marked by conflicts that shape its evolution. If peoples lived in peace without conflicts, history would lack dynamism, for it is conflict that propels the progress of civilizations. Technological, military, and economic rivalries are fueled by competition among civilizations or nations. This competition manifests through conflicts that, according to Hegel, are essential for evolution. As consciousness only progresses through confrontation with contradiction, the experience of the other. In short, without this relationship to otherness and contradiction, consciousness cannot fully develop. Without conflict, the world would remain static, as conflict acts as a vital engine of history. Marx's view, inherited from Hegel, sees history as inherently conflictual or eristic, emphasizing the roles of dispute and discord. This implies, surprisingly, that conflict has a positive function, leading to its own transcendence. According to the adage, if you want peace, prepare for war, overcoming a conflict requires its prior existence. Similarly, truth is only attainable after passing through error, just as peace requires the passage through war. Dialectics is based on the idea that a phenomenon must pass through its opposite to be overcome, thus allowing history to progress. From this perspective, class struggle, or the conflictual economic interactions between owners and proletarians, dominance and dominated in modern language, steers historical evolution. Marx argues that without the conflict dynamic between these groups, represented by the war between victor and vanquished, history would lack a driving force. In summary, for Marx, the struggle between the owning classes and the proletarians shapes the course of the world, following a law of necessity rather than chance. In Hegelian dialectics, the prevailing notion is that the spirit determines matter. Conversely, Marx adopts a materialist stance, asserting that matter shapes the spirit, leading to the concept of historical materialism. Marx rejects the idea of a superior spiritual force guiding the world. Instead, he sees the material world as the source of spirit, reason, and consciousness. This reversal is often described as a materialist inversion of Hegel's philosophy, where, although the dialectical principle remains, asserting that existence is the result of an evolutionary and conflictual process, in Marx's view, matter precedes the idea. Marx illustrates this idea by asserting that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but rather their social condition that shapes their consciousness. In other words, our ideas stem from our material situation, implying that consciousness is a reflection of our experience and material interactions. Depending on the social, economic, and educational context in which a person grows, their ideas and consciousness will form differently. Thus, the diversity of experiences leads to a variety of perspectives, explaining why it can be challenging to understand each other when individuals have divergent life paths. It often happens that we feel out of sync during a conversation with someone who does not share our codes or references. This discrepancy is not merely due to an innate disposition of our mind, but rather stems from differences in our material experiences and interactions with the world. These divergences in life experiences lead to variations in thought and consciousness. When our experiences are radically different or even opposed, it is natural that misunderstanding arises in our exchanges. However, it is precisely within these interactions that the opportunity lies to expand our own field of consciousness by exposing ourselves to experiences foreign to our own. Thus, meeting with others who have lived differently enriches our perception. If, according to Marx, our consciousness is entirely shaped by our material conditions, often economic and social, this raises a profound question about freedom. If we are completely determined by our material context, it implies that our way of thinking is conditioned by our environment. Our material situation thus influences our way of conceiving the world, supporting the idea that our consciousness is the direct product of these material conditions. I argue that according to Marx, there is no true freedom because freedom involves the self-determination of our consciousness, the ability to transcend the determinism that shapes us. If our thoughts are entirely influenced by our experiences, and these experiences are themselves determined by unavoidable forces, then we are trapped in a predetermined way of thinking, which contradicts the notion of freedom. Marx believes that we do not have the freedom to extract ourselves from this determinism. It is crucial to understand Marx's concept of alienation, that our thoughts derive from our material condition, thereby limiting our freedom of consciousness, which is shaped by socioeconomic factors and the course of history. The problem with this Marxist view is the contradiction between the complete determination of existence and the intrinsic feeling of freedom we experience, as well as our belief in our own autonomy. Despite a deterministic perspective, we live and act daily as if we were free and masters of our decisions. For instance, when shopping, we do not allow others to choose for us, reflecting our need to act according to our own will. Alienation, etymologically linked to the word alien, meaning other, describes the process by which an individual loses control of their own existence, becoming dominated by external forces, thus embodying the concept of being other or alien to oneself. Alienation means losing control over our essence, our consciousness, which defines us as human beings. To illustrate Marx's concept of alienation, let's consider a hypothetical exchange between a freelancer and an employee. These two figures, although seemingly divergent, share similar perspectives on the analysis of the economic world, from both liberal and Marxist sides. Imagine a freelancer explaining to an employee that his work doesn't truly belong to him, but serves the interests of his employer. He points out that the employee sells his labor in exchange for a salary, which is merely a means of survival. The outcome of his work belongs to the employer, generating a profit that is the essence of exploitation. This term, exploitation, describes the use of resources or situations for personal gain, illustrating the reduction of the employee to an object in the service of the employer. In response, the employee might acknowledge that this situation allows him to live and provide for his family, sometimes even noting a good relationship with his boss. However, this acceptance illustrates Marxist alienation, the internalization by the employee of the employer's interests, thus accepting a fundamentally imbalanced situation. Instead of recognizing his essential position, which enables the owner to maintain their economic and social status, the employee focuses on the elements that bind him to his current condition, locking him into his role as the exploited. This serves precisely the interests of the employer, as exploitation cannot exist without the consent of the exploited. It's important to note that this analysis does not pass judgment on the worker, but aims to highlight the structural dynamics of exploitation. Alienation describes a process where the worker psychologically justifies a survival situation, forced to accept unchosen conditions. How can one admit to being a slave? This question underscores the central dilemma of alienation, the difficulty of consciously admitting such a condition. Individuals are forced to rationalize an endured reality, seeking meaning in an imposed situation. Alienation transcends a simple logical explanation, embodying the assimilation of another's will, where individual consciousness is supplanted by that of another entity. This phenomenon goes beyond the search for causes to achieve a form of deep legitimization or adherence, leading to the acceptance of servitude. As Laboiti pointed out, this means taking on the responsibility for one's own submission, not individually, but collectively. Alienation differs from the enrichment of consciousness through the experience of otherness. It represents instead a reduction, even an annihilation of our field of consciousness, acting against our own interests. Thus, alienation challenges the notion of freedom, which presupposes an active and autonomous consciousness, and even the notion of consent, which does not take into account the alienating dynamic. Consent is not valid if our consciousness is influenced by that of another. This is akin to obtaining someone's signature on their will after intoxicating them, thus altering their state of consciousness and depriving them of their capacity to make informed decisions. Marx argues that to alienate our consciousness, it is not necessary to resort to substances. Creating objective conditions that lead us to self-alienate is sufficient by adopting the other's perspective to justify our material situation. An employee may perceive himself as dependent on his employer and company, leading him to rationalize his exploited position without ever questioning or seeking to oppose it. The fear of losing our means of subsistence can lead us to view our exploitation as a privilege, a paradox highlighted by Marx as central in the social and economic relations that shape human history. Alienation is such deep conditioning that one does not realize being under its influence, not even contemplating the possibility of being alienated. Questioning our situation, or simply pondering our alienation, marks the beginning of escaping this state. As George Orwell's novel 1984 shows, when we lose the words to articulate our condition, we lose control over our own destiny. Alienation is such conditioning that we do not realize being its victim. To illustrate, consider the extreme example of a child abused and exploited within their own family, completely unaware that another reality exists elsewhere. This child, having no other point of reference, will perceive their situation as normal. This lack of comparison prevents them from questioning the normality of their condition, thus illustrating the essence of alienation, the unquestioned acceptance of one's servitude and a misunderstanding of their problematic situation. Alienation leads to an adaptation where, through habit, repetition transforms an experience into a norm. It represents the loss of capacity to reflect on one's own condition and to recognize one's servitude. In the context of alienation, physical coercion is not necessary. Mature totalitarianism is one that does not need to force people, as their consciousness is already aligned with the exploiter's interests. Less advanced totalitarian regimes still need to use force and intimidation to maintain control. However, by alienating consciousness, domination is exercised through apparent consent, making physical coercion unnecessary. In this case, rebellion is unlikely because the exploited becomes complicit in their own subjugation. To lighten the discussion, let's consider the example of Molière's The School for Wives, where Arnulf, fearing deception, controls the existence of his ward, unaware that domination does not guarantee loyalty or love. In The School for Wives by Molière, Arnulf fears being deceived by his future wife. To prevent this, he decides to marry Agnes, his ward, whom he has deliberately kept ignorant about romantic affairs in the outside world to prevent her from being tempted by infidelity. He thus engages in a process of mental alienation, creating an environment where Agnes cannot even conceive the idea of being unfaithful. This approach reflects the notion that if one directly influences a person's mentality, there is no longer a need to monitor or physically restrict their actions. They will conform on their own. However, Arnulf's plan fails when Agnes meets Horace and falls in love with him, illustrating that escaping alienation often requires an external disruptive element. Alienation implies a programmed acceptance of the situation, highlighting that consent can be inadequate or even a tool of domination. Edward Bernays, in his book Propaganda, explains that to manipulate a population, obtaining its consent is necessary, not merely coercing it. Consent thus becomes a means to legitimize social and political control, illustrating how individuals can be bound by a contract that, while based on their agreement, can also subject them. In a context where individual desire is sacralized, it becomes easy to manipulate consciousness to serve the interests of power, often disguised under pretexts beneficial to the individual. Alienation, therefore, is the process of detachment from one's own consciousness in favor of another, which, under the guise of defending our interests, actually serves its own. Alienation is a mechanism often operating under the pretext of acting for our good, masking the fact that actions undertaken on our behalf may serve to alienate us. This process is particularly insidious because it alters consciousness, a fundamental element of our humanity. According to Marx, alienation increases in the worker as he produces more commodities, implying a greater participation in the economic system that exploits him. This evokes the psychological concept of escalation of commitment. The more one is involved in a situation, the harder it becomes to exit. However, engaging in a process and consenting to it are different matters. Alienation goes further, leading to the perception of an exploitative situation as normal or even beneficial. In the United States, for example, one can observe employees who, from a Marxist perspective, are exploited but take pride in their situation, especially when they are recognized or rewarded by the company. In the modern world, management aims to empower employees by entrusting them with tasks and responsibilities, which can paradoxically increase their alienation. As workers produce, they themselves become commodities, evaluated and exchanged based on their docility rather than their skills, thereby eliminating elements that could challenge the dominant economic system. In conclusion, despite the tendency towards alienation in our economic system, where intelligence may seem detached from real thought, there remains hope. Individually and collectively, we are the guardians of human consciousness, capable of resisting alienation and preserving our essence. On our planet, the battle to preserve our consciousness must take precedence over all other struggles. It is a battle that must be waged, for failing to do so would be a grave error. It is crucial to recognize that this fight is primarily an introspection, a resistance against the elements within ourselves that cloud our vision and turn against our own interest. Thank you.